this sermon series on Revelation. Hey, Lowell, can you make sure my mic's turned on back there? Oh, perfect. Thanks, Teddy. Can y'all hear this? It's more technical issues, you know. That is super fun. All right. No, wait, was that something? No, nothing. It's okay. We've had all sorts of technical issues tonight, so who knows? Hey, Lowell, are any of the mics working back there? I'm going to check this real quick. Y'all feel free to discuss amongst yourselves. Do I now? Check, check, check. All right, just kidding. I didn't have to walk back there. That was a test to see if y'all would talk in church. Okay, Book of Revelation. That is what we are studying on Wednesday nights, doing a complete walkthrough of this book. And we're in chapter 3. So if you want to find your place, Revelation chapter 3. And this is the section where Jesus is writing these letters to the 7 churches, and he has a message for them. He wants to remind them of something about himself. He wants to address the issues that they are dealing with as a church, and he's also communicating his hope for how they will proceed as a church. And we come to this church in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. You know, that's where we get our name, and of our own Philadelphia here in the States. But this city was really interesting because they were facing so many obstacles as a church, to the point where they were completely overwhelmed by all the obstacles that they were facing. And I was thinking about this, and I was thinking how it's still a pretty familiar situation today, right? We were just talking about Joseph and being in Utah and all the opportunities that he had for ministry out there and has for ministry out there, but he's facing all these different obstacles. I was thinking even about the past few years, you know. Think about 2020. We just thought it was going to be another normal year, right? Another normal year of ministry for the church, and then we were hit with all these different obstacles. We were hit with COVID. And what it should have been was a time where we as a collective people were like, oh, here's this brand new novel virus that we've never encountered before. Let's figure out a way to deal with it. But let's all join together and, you know, have a sense of love for one another and combat this. And really what it turned into almost very quickly, I don't know if y'all remember this, how quickly it turned into churches versus the government. Here's this brand new virus, could kill you, might not. No one knows anything about it. Rather than focusing on dealing with that, it became churches versus the government. And the government every week was putting out new regulations saying, here's how many people can meet at your church this week. I knew of churches that were basically like reserving tickets. Hey, if you want to come to church, you have to be one of the first 50 people to reserve a ticket to church, and then you can come, and other people can't come. And so it's first come, first serve type situation. And then it escalated because there were people, many faithful pastors who said, well, I know what the government's telling us to do, but God says in His Word that we're to gather together. And so they kept meeting. And many governments did not like that. Many governments tried to shut down the churches that were continuing to meet. I think of in California in particular, Grace Community Church, John MacArthur's church, they tried their best to get him shut down. And he was facing all these type of obstacles. And in 2020, and even now, you begin to wonder, how on earth is it possible to do ministry when we're facing all these different obstacles? We're still facing them today. We're not having to deal with as many shutdowns today, but think about the amount of societal pressure that we face today. As Christians, as a church, you want to do ministry, you want to get the gospel out there, and people say you've got to change your message if you want to do that. Your gospel's offensive. We need you to accept these things and condone these things and change your message to fit this agenda, and if you don't, well then we're going to shut you down. We're going to censor your message. We're going to take it off YouTube and Facebook and everything else. You will do what we tell you to do. And you're left wondering, how do you do ministry facing this many obstacles? It's incredibly tough. And that's the situation that the church in Philadelphia was facing as they were trying to do ministry as well. And here's Jesus' whole point to this church. Rather than being overwhelmed by these obstacles, He wants them to learn to see obstacles as opportunities. So rather than looking at all these obstacles that you face as a church, as Christians, learning to look at those obstacles and rather than being overwhelmed by them, see them as opportunities. And I want you to notice how he starts this letter. So look at verse 7. He says, "And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, the words of the Holy One, the true One, who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, and who shuts and no one opens." Now remember, Jesus starts these letters. He's wanting to communicate something about himself that that city in particular needs to know. And Jesus thought that the church in Philadelphia needed to know that he held the keys of David. What does that mean? What are the keys of David? Or in this instance, the key of David. Okay. A key denotes that you have authority over something. That's good. Yeah, so if you think back to the kingdom as it was in the Old Testament, this is actually a really important Old Testament reference, right? Because back in the kingdom days of the Old Testament, nobody could just enter the palace and go walk up to the king. That kind of a thing didn't happen. Nobody just had unlimited access to the king. And if you were just an outsider or a commoner, you certainly couldn't come into the palace and see the king. You had to go through someone. And this person in particular, he was the master of the palace, and he was said to basically hold the key of the palace. Sometimes he was even said to be the key of the palace, because if you wanted to get into the palace, and if you wanted to see the king, you had to go through him. He was the one who could open the doors for you, and if he shut the doors on you, you weren't getting in. You had to go through this person. And so what Jesus is saying here is that he is the true master of the palace. He is the master of the kingdom of God. He holds the key of David, being a reference to the kingdom of God, and he's saying, I alone open that door, and I alone shut that door. And unless I open it, you're not getting in. And once I shut it, no one else is getting in. You cannot enter the kingdom of God except through Jesus. And that's what Jesus said in John 10:9. He said, I'm the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved. He said in John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And so Jesus wants to communicate to this church. He wants to tell this church, listen, the kingdom of God is mine. I hold the keys to the kingdom. I will open the door for whoever I want to. I will close the door when I'm good and ready to close that door, but no one is getting in except through me. And then notice what he says in the first part of verse 8. He says, I know your works. Behold, I have set before you an open door, which no one is able to shut. I want to just pause there for a second. He's telling the church that he has set before them an open door. What is this open door? There you go. Yeah, opportunity. Another way to say it is it's an open door for ministry, in other words. Yeah. It's an open door for ministry, and specifically two aspects of ministry, which Michael just alluded to one of them there, which is evangelism and effective work. When you think of this open door that Jesus has set before the church, he says, here's your open door, and this is an open door for ministry, for evangelism, and for effective work. And there's references to this in the Bible. And in Colossians 4, in chapter 3, or in chapter 4, in verse 3, Paul was asking for prayer that God may open to us a door for the Word, to declare the mystery of Christ. He's saying we need an open door for evangelism, and only God can open that door, so he's asking, pray that God would do this. He says later in 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 9, that a wide door for effective work has been opened to me. And so you have these references to open doors in the New Testament, and it's always evangelism and effective work. And Jesus is saying, hey, church in Philadelphia, this is what you have before you. I personally have set this open door before you. You have an opportunity here to evangelize and do good works. And see, it's interesting because he's talking to the church in Philadelphia, but the city of Philadelphia was a really interesting city because it kind of served as like a missionary city in a lot of ways, a secular missionary city, if such a thing exists. But basically, it was located in a really strategic area. It was bordering 3 different countries, and it was said to be the gateway to the central plateau of Asia Minor. So remember, these are the 7 churches that were in Asia Minor, and Philadelphia was said to be the gateway to the central plateau in Asia Minor. And the person who founded the city specifically founded it so that he could spread the Greek language and culture to all the surrounding areas. That was his goal. He said, here we have this very strategic city, and what we want to do with this city is we want to use it to spread Hellenism to all the surrounding areas that are around us. And they were really good at this. The city of Philadelphia was great at this. They accomplished that work and that mission to spread Hellenism around them. And Jesus is saying, listen to me, you have that same open door. Just as this city spread Hellenism all around to the surrounding areas, I want you to spread the gospel and the work of the kingdom in the exact same way. It's the same open door for you. The same strategic location of the city provides an open door for ministry for the church. And that's what Jesus wanted them to see. But when they were hearing that, they didn't see opportunity. They saw obstacles. They said, Jesus, we're hearing you. We know what you're saying. We're not denying any of it. But here we are in our little old church, and all we see before us are a bunch of obstacles. And so it made me wonder, what keeps us from seeing overwhelming obstacles as opportunities? I mean, we do it all the time, right? But what is it that actually keeps us from seeing these obstacles as opportunities? And I think that's what Jesus wanted them to consider, because I think you see a couple answers to that question. I think one thing that'll keep you from seeing obstacles as opportunities is by focusing on yourself. Notice what he says in the second part of verse 8. He says, I know that you have but little power, and yet you've kept my word and have not denied my name. He says, I know that you have little power. Now, if he's addressing that and saying that in this letter to them, they're probably thinking about that, right? They're like, Jesus, I know you say we're in this great location, but we don't have a lot of power. We're a pretty small church. I mean, just think about this for a second. We can imagine some of the shortcomings they might have experienced there in the church in Philadelphia, right? I mean, at the time that this letter was written, Philadelphia was a relatively new city, all things considering. And the church there was even newer, so you can imagine they didn't have a lot of people there. Christianity was brand new at the time, and so they, of course, didn't have a lot of people there at their church. They would have been a really small church right here in Philadelphia. Because of that, they probably had little to no influence at all on the surrounding culture, the society, the government, anything like that. And keep in mind, remember, in the first century, Christians didn't really have a great reputation, did they? They were called all sorts of stuff. People didn't like them, and so they would have had a bad reputation amongst the community. And that's what they were focusing on. Jesus says, you've got this great opportunity to spread the word. You've got this great opportunity to do good work. And they said, Jesus, we've got no power. We've got no people. We've got no influence. Nobody even really likes us. All we see are obstacles, and that's the problem. Is they were not focusing on the sovereign power of God to accomplish His own will. They were focused on all of their shortcomings as a church. And I think that's a quick way to be able to not see opportunity before you. You see an obstacle rather than opportunity. It's when you're focusing on yourself too much. I want us to know something this evening, is that our shortcomings do not hinder the success of God's plans. And that's pretty encouraging, is it not, church? Our shortcomings do not hinder the success of God's plans. It means it's not all on you. It means you don't have to be great. You don't have to be the best speaker out there. You don't have to be able to have this great memory to memorize every single Bible verse and know it and quote it by heart. You don't have to know all the strategies for ministry and to do this and that. Jesus says, it's not on you. It's on me. I'm the one who is going to accomplish my own will. And our shortcomings cannot prevent that. God actually works through our shortcomings. I mean, you remember in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, when Paul said that God's power is perfected, made perfect in our weakness. As we embrace our weakness and our shortcomings, God's power is manifested to the world. It's magnified to the world. And God always does this. He shows up and does great things with weak people, right? I mean, remember when the Midianites were oppressing the people of Israel? And Gideon was going to go up against them, and he had this great big army, and God said, no, that's too many. If I were to let you go right now, y'all would win, you'd get all the glory for yourselves. Let's cut it down. And Gideon said, all right, how about now? God said, it's still too many. We're going to have to whittle it down some more. How many people did Gideon finally have? You remember? 300. That's right. Against an entire Midianite army. And they won. So that it would not be said Israel is great and awesome, but it would be said that their God is awesome. Maybe you remember when a ruddy, handsome shepherd boy went out to just feed his brother some lunch and saw a 9-foot giant mocking the enemies of God, or mocking the people of God. And David said, is no one going to stop this guy? Y'all just going to let him sit there and defame God like that? Why doesn't someone do something? And so David did. Took a couple stones, slung one of them, had a true mark, knocked him dead. But he was small. He didn't even have any armor. He went out there just dressed as a shepherd. But the whole point was not so that David would get the glory. It was so it could be said the only way that this little shepherd boy could beat the giant Goliath is if God was on his side. It was so that God would get the glory. And here's the thing. God's will was done not because Gideon was powerful and not because David was powerful, but because God is powerful. And if God can work through Gideon, and if He can work through David, and He can work through this church in Philadelphia, I think He could probably work through us too, right? That's what He wants to encourage them to see. I mean, we have many of the same problems as this church, right? We're a newish church in the sense of where we came from at the split. I mean, our church has been around for a long, long time, but you know our history. We didn't have a lot of people when, right after that split, we still don't have a ton of people. We don't have a lot of influence in the area. We certainly don't have the resources as a lot of these other churches. And it'd be real easy to be discouraged by that, right? And say, God, how could we possibly do effective ministry? Look at all the shortcomings we have. Look at the lack of people and money and resources and all this influence. We don't have any of it, God. What can we possibly do? And He says, I've set an open door before you. You have the opportunity to spread the gospel and do good work. And if you don't see that opportunity, if you see those as obstacles, it's because you're focusing too much on yourself. I mean, just think about where God's placed us as a church, right? I mean, we're right here next to Greenville, Anderson, Pickens, Clemson, Powdersville. I mean, we're in a very similar type location to Philadelphia, are we not? I mean, people have to go through us to get to all these other places. That seems like a pretty good opportunity to spread the gospel. And not only that, but Easley is growing. Have you seen how many new subdivisions and apartment buildings and all these other developments have been coming along? They're just everywhere now, right? Easley is growing. And God says, here's your open door. Do something with it. Preach the gospel. Do effective work. Don't focus on all your shortcomings. Focus on the opportunity that you have before you and trust that I am sovereign and powerful enough to make good on what I've promised to do. It's not on you, church. God's going to do it. He says, but it's up to you. You've got to walk through that door. You've got to take that opportunity. But I think we won't see those as opportunities as long as we focus on ourselves and our shortcomings. But I think another thing that would keep us from seeing them as opportunities is by focusing on opposition. So you could focus on your own shortcomings, and that's going to distract you. Or you could focus on the opposition, and that'll also distract you. I want you to notice what he says in verse 9. He says, behold, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say that they are Jews and are not, but lie, behold, I will make them come and bow down before your feet, and they will learn that I have loved you. Now, notice he's saying that just like in Smyrna, here in Philadelphia, there was a Jewish community that was hostile to the Christians there. They were persecuting the Christians there. They wanted nothing to do with them. In fact, church history records that in the city of Philadelphia, Christians were completely expelled from the Jewish synagogues. They were isolated from the culture and the society there. Basically, they were ostracized in their community. No one wanted anything to do with them, and so they felt completely all alone here. They were cut off entirely. I mean, the same thing happens to us today, right? Maybe not as drastically, but you talk to your coworkers and try to spread the gospel. Guess who's not getting invited to lunch anymore? You tell people about your faith in Jesus, guess who's going to start getting some stares and some weird looks? You take a stand on what the Bible teaches, especially with regard to things like homosexuality and abortion and all this other stuff that's going on in our world today. Just watch and see how quickly people condemn you and want nothing to do with you. You try to correct your own friends and family. Tell them what the Bible says. They're quick to say, we want nothing to do with you. Or we would prefer if you didn't show up to Thanksgiving dinner. It'd make us happy. The Christians in Philadelphia were faithful to Jesus, and so they were cut off. They were mocked and ridiculed. Same thing that happens to us today. And here's the thing. When all that happens, what's the tendency for a lot of people who call themselves Christians today? What do? They compromise, right? Well, I don't want people to think I'm weird. I want people to like me. I want to be accepted. I want to go in the break room and let people have me sit at their table. I want to get the invite to lunch. I want people to think I'm cool and with it and everything like that. And so what do? We compromise. We change the message. We water down the gospel. We give people a gospel that is sure not to offend them, all while saying we're Christians, even though we've done away with our very distinctness as Christians. Changing the message. We want so desperately to be liked by all people, and yet Jesus said in Luke 6:26, woe to you when all people speak well of you. That's pretty concerning, is it not? We make it our main goal to have all people speak well of us, and Jesus says, woe to you when all people speak well of you. If that's the case, you're not doing something right. Because we need to understand this. The gospel is offensive by nature. It just is. The gospel is offensive, and it will offend people when you give it to them straight. When you present the gospel to people who are still in their sins, who want to acknowledge no other God than the one they've created in their own mind, they are not going to receive it well. They're going to hate you and reject you, mock you, insult you. But you need to understand something, folks. This world will not be won to Christ by a gospel that has no power to save. You might tell people you're preaching the gospel all the time. You might say you're sharing the gospel all the time. But if it has been watered down or changed, that gospel cannot save. Only the true gospel of Jesus Christ can save people from their sins. And it will hurt and it will offend. But listen, the needle has to pierce the skin in order to get the medicine in there, right? And the gospel has to pierce our hearts in order for the old man to go away and the new man to come. The gospel has to be pure. And it's not just individuals that face opposition like this. I mean, it's churches too, is it not? I mean, think about the amount of opposition churches face today. They want to take away like Title IX and special privileges, tax-exempt privileges of the church. I mean, a couple of years ago, they were trying to press the Equality Act on us, and they were going to have us go along with their government mandates and stuff. It would have meant a lot of changes for our CDC, for our churches, for our bathrooms, things like that. They want us to bow the knee to them, and if we don't, they say, well, we'll do everything we can to get you shut down. I mean, there are people in our community who hate churches. There are people who hate our church, who will talk bad about us, even though we're faithful to God. We're preaching the Bible. We're doing what God says. But that's what you have to understand. It's not just individual Christians that are going to be opposed. It is churches as well. When Jesus says, I have this open door before you, and it's this open door of opportunity, some people are going to say, well, Jesus, I'm too weak. And other people are going to say, well, Jesus, my enemies are too strong. I want you to understand, in the same way that our shortcomings do not hinder the success of God's power or plans, oppositional strengths cannot thwart the success of God's plans. That's the other encouraging point. It doesn't matter how weak you are, God's will be done. And it does not matter how strong your enemies are, God's will be done. It doesn't matter how much they oppose the church and our message. It doesn't matter how much they try to get us shut down and put all these new plans into motion and things like that, what they try to take away from us. No enemy can stand against God. His will be done. And I remember just the best example from back in 2020 when, especially thinking back to John MacArthur's church and Grace Community Church, I mean, the California government tried so hard to get that church shut down. They did everything they could. I mean, Gavin Newsom in particular, he basically declared war on John MacArthur and on Grace Community Church. Took them to court, tried to sue them, do all this kind of stuff. I mean, they're a pretty big church, but they're not the biggest. But they said, all right, we're just going to keep trusting God. Let Him handle it. That's a pretty big opponent to go up against, is it not? The California government. I mean, of all the governments that a church would not want to go up against, probably that one. I mean, one of the states that's probably most opposed to Christianity and the gospel, and there they are, and yet they won the court case. And then Gavin Newsom said, okay, well, if we can't win in court, we're going to seize your parking lots. Have people show up to church then. They have nowhere to park. What are they going to do? Walk? Church prayed about it. Asked God to provide a way to win the battle over this. And so the local businesses and even local synagogues, Jewish synagogues said, hey, we don't meet on Sundays. Why don't you use our parking lots? And so they ended up having more parking space than they did before because God provided a way. When they won the court case, the proposed settlement was going to be $400,000. That's pretty nice. The actual settlement was for twice that, $800,000. Here you have this big opponent that is doing everything they can to oppose God and oppose the church and enforce their will on them. And God says, it doesn't matter how big you are. I'm bigger. My will be done. My faithful people will be rewarded. The church will stand. The gospel will go forward. And there's not a thing you can do about it. Because I am God and there is no other. That's the encouragement. He says to Philadelphia, he said, it doesn't matter how big your homes are. I know that there's a little synagogue of Satan here. doing good works in the name of the Lord, and then you will see people come to Christ. And the kingdom builds, and this world is claimed for Christ. As Jesus says here, he who has an ear, let him hear